by definition, involved also as a human being in human values. I'm speaking of the breakdown between the scientific man as scientific man and, on the other hand, as human being. When he goes into his laboratory, does he carry his value system with him? And I would answer, on the basis of the compelling and overwhelming and obvious evidence, that he has all too often in the past not done so. And that seems to me the vital concern. Now, I would pose the question to all of us here. Why are we here? What are we doing here? Are we here to be frightened out of our wits? Are we here because we are merely curious? Are we here, as Professor Young suggests, because this has some of the dimensions of the Joe Pine show and the indulgence in catchphrase pedagogy and all the rest of it? Or are we here out of a deep concern for the human condition in our own time and in all time to come, and what we might conceivably do about it? As I've listened to all of this wash of ideas this evening, my own included, it occurs to me that we have a plethora, really, of ideas here. We have an embarrassment of riches, one of the possible consequences of which will be that we will come away from here with nothing at all but a 2-hour evening spent sometimes in amusement, sometimes in deep concern, but an evening of exhaustion after all. And with that, I abdicate.
Our discussion is now open for questions and comments by the speakers on one another's presentations, and I call first on Arnold Mandel.
I'm continuing to be appalled by the role of the scientist in this series, and the insensitivity of the creative people like Mr. Young and Corwin to the shared dilemma of the scientist and the artist, who's considered a scourge and a threat via his creativity and appears to necessitate control. And I would like to ask them to consider the possibility of setting up a panel of scientists to study and pass on radio, TV, and movie scripts, which probably constitute a greater threat to our values than penicillin, anti-tumor agents, and saving people's lives with artificial kidneys, and suggest that next year the writers go first.
May I answer that? I share Dr. Mandel's feeling about a good deal of the wash on TV, but I don't think you can quite equate Beverly Hillbillies with the atom bomb or germicidal warfare or any of these nifties that science has delivered to us. I don't think that Dr. Young nor I myself wish to denigrate the scientist. I thought I was very careful to say that I was not referring to all scientists, but too many of them. And within 15 minutes after I made this remark, complaining of or charging that the scientist does not carry his concern into a laboratory, that his awareness of the human condition and his concern for it seems to end at the laboratory door, Dr. Bleibtreu said, and I quote him I think exactly, "There is no connection between science and morality, neither negative nor positive," which confirms what I said. I feel, I submit to you, that that's the trouble.
Would anyone else on the panel like to comment on this central problem? Dr. Carlson.
Yes, I have a few commentaries about Mr. Corwin's remarks. I would like to invite Mr. Corwin to take a trip back to 1715 and raise the types of questions he raised today for the future, but looking at it from the world of 1715. And I suspect his comments would be as appropriate then as today. It would be, why are you wasting your time studying the laws of gravitation? Why are you wasting your time fooling around with the internal structure of organisms? There is so much poverty, there is so much death, there is so much misery in the human condition today. Why don't you work on that? And suppose they had worked on that, and that a Louis Pasteur, instead of taking an interest in yeast cells bubbling in wine, had instead worked directly on some problems of human pathology without any knowledge that there were germs. Would there have been a germ theory? Would childbed fever have been eliminated? Would the infectious diseases which you allow to be eliminated for the future have ever been eliminated from our own 20th century?
I am surprised, Dr. Carlson, that you can extrapolate both ways and go back to the past. My cautions and concern about the human condition in the 17th century, I'm sure, would not be affected by inquiries into pathogens, into germs. I think I cannot travel back there with the ease that you do, but I don't think that I would be alarmed at the prospect of any inquiry that was made toward the solution of toward a cure for the ills of man. And I remind you that I said, I think very clearly, that we are all beneficiaries of the glories of medicine and the achievements that have alleviated our pain and helped us to lift the very heavy mortal burden that we carry around once we're born. I understand the resentment of the scientist to my attack on his sense of rarefaction, on his living in the vacuum. I do not apply this, as I thought, at least I tried to make clear, I do not apply this to the feeling scientist, the man who does care. I think that applies to every man on this panel. It certainly applies to scientists of the order of Linus Pauling and Einstein and Dr. Spock. It does not apply to too many men working for armaments, working in the field of easy formulas. You see, men are working now, Dr. Carlson. Dr. Pasteur was looking for a way of combating and overcoming disease. But the scientist who has reversed that field by devising germs that will destroy man, that puts an entirely different face on it. So I reject the assumption that because I am opposed to wanton speculations about biology today, I would have been opposed to them back in that time. I should just like to pass on a rather remarkable sentence or two from Ralph Waldo Emerson, notwithstanding Herman Melville's feeling about Mr. Emerson. He said, "The fact that the seeds of corruption are buried in the causes of improvement strikes us everywhere in the political, moral, and natural history of the world. It seems to indicate the intentions of Providence to limit human perfectibility and to bind together good and evil like life and death by indissoluble connection." Now, the operative phrase in this, for me, is the first one, the fact that the seeds of corruption are buried everywhere in the causes of improvement. I think that's a concern at any time.
Dr. Bleibtreu, Dr. Young, and Dr. Berwick. In that order.
We're going to do it in unison.
Okay. It always puzzles me when it's said that things are so much better today than they were before because of we don't have childbed fever, etc. We don't really know, of course, how to measure whether things are any better today or not. We can say there's less sickness, yes. But are people any happier? Would we have been any happier had we lived then, or are we happier now? And does life have any more meaning now? We're so glib about this. We always say things are so much better thanks to science. It would be interesting to see how this could be tested. I'm not at all convinced that that's so.
I simply wanted to add that the problem with the 18th century was its naivete. at a point when science was able to begin building up its investigations to the point when we now have a germ theory, it did not have to be concerned with the side effects of its endeavors to the extent that we now have to be concerned. We are concerned now for the very superficial notion that we might obliterate ourselves or that we might organize ourselves into passivity so that we will either be passive because we are dead or passive because we are alive. We have to accept the geometric, if not trigonometric progression of ideas which have overcome us. Because the germ theories and others have been perfected, the scientist is in a position of going into the unknown in a way which we cannot predict. It's at this point that we have to say that the social controls of the 18th century are inadequate for the 20th century. We have to say that the implications of science in the computer age require an agility of mind and of imagination and of conscience equal at least to that of the computer.
I would just like to refer again, but this time in the form of a question to the scientists here present, to the problem that I mentioned in my remarks. The problem, that is to say, of the isolation from scientific enterprise per se, from the values, the accretion of values in human society, and to pose the question as a highly practical one, as it seems to me, of whether science must, in point of fact, exist in that kind of vacuum. We know that the scientist himself does not necessarily exist in such a vacuum, but I wonder about the consequences for scientific enterprise itself. If instead of imposing controls by some body of elders or from outside, in any case, of the scientific enterprise, the scientist were to impose his own controls, we would not be in a much better condition. Dr. Carlson?
There are dangers to such an approach. I remember reading a letter that Leonardo da Vinci once wrote to a potential sponsor. And in this letter he said, "I can invent any machine to tear down any defense. I can invent any defense to be impervious to any attack." And I remember an exhibit that IBM put on of the machines that Leonardo da Vinci had worked out. And I was very frightened by this, because somehow, before I had encountered this, I had a naive thought that the values of an artist and the values of a scientist were different. But they're not. They're human values in both cases. And the important thing is not for the scientist to create a special scientific value for his technology and the implications of his imagination, but for him to realize that he too is a human being, and he cannot be asked to perform a miraculous activity in value creation the way his imagination can control technology. This, I think, is the dilemma, and this, I think, is where the scientist's responsibility comes in as a human being.
I would like to phrase the question that I think we must all have in our minds in some fashion or other relates to the problem that we cannot be certain of any of the positions that anybody takes on any of these many subjects. For example, when Pasteur began to study the yeasts in wine, and I'm sure this was Dr. Carlson's intent, he really didn't know in advance that he was going to be finding information that would lead to discoveries that had to do with human diseases. He was making an objective scientific inquiry. How can we know in advance what the consequences of a human activity is? And I asked Norman Corwin, in all of my previously demonstrated humble admiration, how can we deal with the recommendation that he made concerning science when it comes to the realm of art and literature? For example, there have been at all times throughout history inquisitors, one kind or another, who would burn the artworks, not to mention the artists, with whom they didn't agree. If it's true, as you say, that the progress of civilization has much more depended upon art than it has upon science, how are we to safeguard that progress from the work of the censors, against whom, as I understand it, you have recently joined a committee?
As well, Dr. Gorney, I'm very flattered that you ask me for a suggestion as to how it can be done. If I'm just an old, intuitive, neurotic member of the Writers Guild, an aging member, and if I had the answer to that, I'd flash it to Washington. But all I can say is that every value that we hold as human beings, every moral value, and don't tell me that there are none, because they've certainly been articulated from the time of Hammurabi through Moses and onward, and we have had a chance to sift them out by now, or at least to start to. Every one of these things has to be struggled for. I ask of the scientist not that he solve all the problems of control of his inventions, but that he think about them in relation to the people, in relation to people, in relation to human beings. That's all I ask. And this, the thrilling thing about this series of evenings is that we have heard men thinking out loud, so to speak, about these problems. I think it's a marvelous prototype for kind of work that should be done everywhere. There was once a United Nations conference that I haven't seen repeated in subsequent years, and I'm very sorry about that. It had the name, the abbreviation UNSCR, and that stood for the unwieldy name of United Nations Conference on the Conservation and Utilization of Resources. And scientists met from all over the world to study this problem, and it was a marvelous meeting. Fruitful things came from it. I just wish that this could be done on an international level, that our tempers and passions would so abate in relation to the world political situation that scientists, who are the best equipped to discuss these things, could get together and discuss them.
I'd like to comment on the possibility that scientists are ill-equipped to talk about these things. I would like to suggest the possibility that famous mathematicians and physicists like Oppenheimer, for example, are not particularly better equipped to talk about world peace than anyone in this audience. That their area of special training and special capacity lies in their particular area of specialty, and not necessarily in the area of working with philosophy and values. And it's entirely possible that scientists are not equipped to deal with the kinds of questions, that they should be made subject of these issues, but are not necessarily experts. And maybe there should be another group of people more involved.
May I comment here? There's an article I was reading about Dr. Spock recently. Dr. Spock, who has been rather vocal in his opposition to the present war, wrote an article for Harper's Magazine on this subject. And he got a letter from the editor of Harper's saying, while we recognize that you are eminently equipped to discuss matters that, in which you have competence in your field of child psychology, you are not necessarily equipped to discuss war. Well, who is? Who is? It is as what Lincoln said about slavery. He says, you can't discuss it in the slave states because it is there. You can't discuss slavery in the free states because it isn't there. You can't discuss it in the pulpit because it's religion. Where then, he said, can you discuss it? Certainly, I would agree with Dr. Mandel that perhaps Oppenheimer is not the best qualified or best qualified man to discuss these issues, but who is? Who is? The men we have elected?
Now we will take questions from the floor.
Mr. Corwin, would you suggest that a scientist who in the course of his labors comes upon something new that may, maybe in his own very opinion, do some harm to someone, that scientist should stop immediately and destroy it, or not to proceed?
Do some harm to someone is subject to semantic examination. There has perhaps been no antitoxin developed that has not harmed somebody, but certainly in the large, in the actuarial figures, as applied to masses of people, inoculation has been a great boon. But I can perhaps best answer your question by citing an incident out of my childhood. I was studying high school chemistry, and one day was, when I learned about the properties of certain elements, one day was seized with the inspiration. I could devise a gas, I thought, that would go right through gas masks. And I rushed with this good news to to the chemistry teacher. And he looked at me and said, maybe it would work. Why don't you think about something constructive? We have men who've studied chemistry a lot longer than you, and there are men busy working on destructive gases. Why don't you just leave that to somebody else and turn your thoughts toward constructive chemistry? I do think that a scientist must not necessarily have all the answers, but at least let him inquire, let him be concerned, let him share that concern, as Albert Einstein did. He was worried before the bomb. At least that was an act of human citizenship.
Next question.
Now, as a prelude to my question, I'd like to state that I do not believe the great progress of the world has come from either art or science. It has come from nonsense states of mind, which probably God gives, since God's smarter than science. And I use this as an illustration. When a boy is 17 years of age, he suddenly meets a girl and he thinks she's the most glorious thing in the world. Complete state of nonsense. It affects him so much that he's willing to work all the rest of his life to make her happy. Crazy as can be. Now in the future, when science gets a hold of our education, manipulates our minds so that we have no biases or prejudices and no nonsense, what glory can we give to a human being that's based on science? What value are based on truth that can equal the glory that's based upon this nonsense?
Have we an answer from the panel? Well, fortunately, I happen to have found one down here on the floor. I would answer the gentleman who posed this brilliant question that if we can produce all the machinery of creation and destruction that science has created, we can plan bigger and better nonsense too.
Gentlemen, this will be a neutral question. There are about 5 of us fellows here in the audience who are seminarians studying for the Catholic priesthood. And our science teacher asked us to come up here to appreciate science better by hearing scientists talk and to understand man better. Well, we've heard some of the scientists talk, and we've heard some of the humanists talk about science, and in a sense I'm a little disillusioned being an undergraduate. So I'm still looking for the worth and the value of science. So could anyone comment on that?
Dr. Carlson.
I would like to remind you that when your grandparents were alive, what they expected of the world is very different from what your descendants will expect. and even, excuse me, I'll say your parishioners' children. I ought to quit while I'll be. The type of world in which at least I can say your grandparents lived in, was one in which they expected that 1 out of every 3 of their children would die of an infectious disease. This is not something we expect today, even though we have not eliminated all infectious diseases. I would say if you could turn back to the 1715s and earlier, the type of world in which you lived then was one in which you anticipated hardship, starvation, disease, famine, a type of world in which there was no education, a type of world in which you were a victim of circumstances and became a fatalist for your survival. This is no longer what we expect of life. And the reason that that has changed is that there has been an advance in medical science. And it is this benefit in medical science that gives us the opportunity to come to lectures like this to hear about it.
Dr. Carlson, may I ask, does man live by antibiotics alone? What was so terrible about the Elizabethan age? People died, the life expectancy was shorter. What was so terrible about the age of Pericles? People died of diphtheria and many diseases. But you seem to put a premium upon the physical state of the society. I think it's wonderful that we have these things and that we can be here tonight. Yes, I agree with you there. But I'm sorry to disagree with you about the level of priority that you give this ability of the human being today to go through smallpox and to be immune to German measles.
The miraculous thing and the wonderful thing about the age of Pericles is that Pericles did not die of typhus so that we could know about him. And the marvelous thing about the Elizabethan age is that Samuel Pepys lived long enough to give us a diary to see what the time was like. But today, we don't have to face that sort of problem. We don't see individuals nipped in the bud. As parents, we consider it a major trauma if our child has an incurable disease. And we would consider it an abdication of the medical profession if they refuse to give us the immunizations we demand. How can one consider an enjoyment of life if he doesn't live himself? It's only the lucky who are living in the 17th century.
And let me address just for the pleasure of living, too. That is, mental hospitals in the 1700s, and as a matter of fact, up until about 10 years ago, when one visited mental hospitals, one wondered whether it was worthwhile living. And maybe this addresses a little more this problem of pleasure or aesthetic appreciation. The facts are that with drug advances over the last 10 or 15 years, huge millions of people are able to enjoy living and feel the things you're talking about and have the aesthetic appreciation that they wouldn't have had otherwise.
I am very glad for that, and I join the
so they don't even have the pleasure of death.
I join the cheerleaders. But it is quite true that we're lucky that Pericles did live. However, we have billions of people on the face of the earth today who are inheritors of the benefits of medicine. Where is Pericles? Where is Keats? Where is Shelley at any age?
I cannot allow...
It is not antibiotics that produces a greatness in a people or happiness in a people. I wish it were. We'd be terribly happy people all over the world.
Antibiotics cannot produce happiness in a people. It is not possible to drive scientists into a corner this way and make them demonstrate that our age is so much better than that of Pericles or the Elizabethan one on the basis of physical survival. I have passed through some of the halls of science, but am sufficiently redeemed in the realm of humanism to remind you that in the age of Pericles, they flayed alive as a daily routine those who stole a loaf of bread. In that grand Elizabethan age, 8-year-old children were hung publicly for doing the same thing. Now, as an extension of biology, not only have we medical progress, but we have the progress in the aesthetic that grows out of the capacity to live a better life, so that today such hideous spectacles are not practiced, and when genocide on a larger scale occurs, there is an enormous protest against it instead of the benign acceptance that there was in those former eras. Mr. Corwin.
Dr. Gorney, we today do not flay 8-year-old children alive for stealing a loaf of bread. We burn them alive for doing nothing. And we are so lately emerged from wholesale genocide when millions of people are destroyed in this age of survival in the concentration camps. Have we forgotten?
We have a question in the back and then more in front.
Dr. Carlson, do you think it's fair to force or encourage the scientist to make a judgment about his experiment and evaluate it when he, in all honesty, does not know what the future consequences of that experiment will be? I personally think this will kill his creativity, and I'd like to know how you feel about it.
I agree with you, because the type of experiments that most scientists would be doing in a university laboratory are not the types of experiments that have immediate applications to human values. But I think there are instances, and World War II certainly demonstrated these, with the development of atomic energy, where there was an immediate application to human values. And I think there will be other instances of this kind. And where such things have very obvious applications to human values, I think the scientist shares in a collective guilt with everyone else who stands by and says nothing. And I think this is where he has to take a stand and project the values.
Where was there a question in here?
Mr. Corwin, it perhaps has escaped your knowledge that it was Dr. Frank, James Frank, who wrote a letter to President Truman asking that the bomb not be dropped on Hiroshima. I think that the trouble is that the bomb gets into the hands of people who are not scientists. And perhaps the scientists do have the moral values that you claim they don't.
I'm afraid there must be something wrong with the PA system, because I did not say they don't have moral values. They do have them. I said that too many don't have any values, that they are unconcerned with what is done with the product. I'm aware of that letter. I'm aware of Einstein's interest in the matter. I would there were more of it.
I would like to comment for Harry Truman, who is not here tonight. I feel quite certain that he lost a lot of sleep and consulted with a great many fine minds before he issued that order. We might wish that he had dropped the first one on, let us say, Mount Fujiyama to demonstrate its power. But what he had in mind was stopping the war and its horrible toll of death as quickly as possible. And it did that job, and it was a good job that it did. Secondly, I have enjoyed this series very much. Commenting tonight between the warfare between the artist and the scientist, it is the eternal friction between the theoretician and the man who is more guided by his emotions. like the war between the sexes. There is no resolving these wars. They are between two different types of mentalities, and they can argue until doomsday. I have another war that I would like to suggest, and that is the war, this is not a good term, between the theoretician and the practical man. We have had a lot of the splendid comments and information from the theoretician in this series, but there has been little that has been practical. We heard a talk on senescence, but not a thing that we might do to ward off our own personal approach of senescence. I hope that this will be repeated next year, and perhaps we will get down to some practicalities. Perhaps we will discuss what should be done, what we can do as citizens to start purifying our race genetically. Maybe we can start on that lower 10% and eliminate them from contributing to our race genetically.
Professor Jones.
I assume, looking at the clock, that we are just about at the end of this 7-lecture rope. I have an impression that I would like to share with you, perhaps have it commented on the panel, or perhaps have it simply as a requiem or an epilogue. I have the very strong sense, having listened to this panel tonight and reflected on it, that the scientists have not been done well by what I would categorize as the humanists. And I would group myself among that apparently large band, judging by the panel. I have the feeling that the scientists in this 7-week series have undertaken no more responsibility than to tell us what they think the environment will be like if scientific research presently going on simply projects itself. I think that if I may say it, as they always say in the law, with due deference, that Dr. Carlson deserved more of a constructive answer than perhaps we have given him, and I link myself with the word "we" here. I think that Mr. Corwin, I think myself earlier, I think the gentleman from the humanist side have perhaps beaten a little bit too hard on the scientists. And the ironic prospect has occurred here this evening, and that is we are telling the scientists precisely, go and control yourselves. Go and do whatever it is you think is wise. We have not, unfortunately, or fortunately, as destiny will tell us, we have not built the bridges across which the scientists, as I understand them, very fearfully indeed, would like to meet us as humanists. So that we are really telling these gentlemen of the laboratories, go back in your laboratories, don't really bother us with all of these ominous speculations. Let us be. Now I may be exaggerating the impact, but I take it that the impact is this. I think the responsibility for the humanists remains, and the responsibility is to meet the scientists on that bridge. Somehow we've got to build the bridge, and it's not the responsibility of the scientists to build that bridge.
Ron, I would just like to say that certainly there should be the bridge built. I don't think it's the responsibility or even that it lies within the capacity of the humanist to build that bridge, but at least he might suggest where the bridge might be built.
I was just going to add that earlier I made a defense of untidiness, but there's just too much untidiness here for me at the moment. The prospect that Norman Corwin, who I know, and Elof Carlson, whom I know, are disagreeing about something is more than my own tidy mind can accept. I think the kind of debacle that we've got into in the last 15 or 20 minutes is a sure sign that we're still dealing with these problems with 18th century minds. The fact that we have come so quickly from Keith Berwick's notion that we had a richness of idea tonight to the realization that we haven't solved a thing dramatizes, at least for me as a pedagogue, that this last half hour has been extremely useful. The idea that it would only generate, however, a second series of faculty lectures pains me enormously. It suggests the welfare state cum laude. And I would hope that you might be prepared to let others occupy your seats next year. Thank you.
We have time perhaps for one more question. I thought I would let the future pose it.
As Dr. Bradshaw said earlier, he said who should get the kidney in kidney transplantations. The old lady with a lot of kids or the scientist who's making a lot of discoveries. Well, I think if a person is willing to donate a kidney, he should be the one to decide.
I think it a tribute not only to the subject matter, but to the depth of devotion of those who have come this evening and throughout the series, that so many remain right to the end of such a long question and discussion period. I think I know why everybody's here tonight. I don't think it's idle or morbid curiosity, nor is it an attempt to deny the realities that are advancing upon us. I think basically in the heart of each person who comes to be edified by discussions such as these have been, is an abiding sense of the adventure of being alive at this time and the prospects for the future adventure that we can see coming upon us. I know that's why I'm here. I will impute the same motive, at least in large measure, to everybody else. To those who've participated in the series, regardless of the individual points of view which have been articulated, I think we can ascribe that same sense of adventure. The human agenda unfolds as a contribution created bit by each and every one of us. We don't know much beyond the next page and a half. How we plan for that visible portion of the spectrum to come will control whether or not there are any subsequent pages. I want to leave you with a few short ideas. The first come from Jacob Bronowski of the Salk Institute, a mathematician and writer whose books Science and Human Values and The Identity of Man I would heartily recommend to all of you. He points out that the human gift is the gift of imagination, shared equally by the scientist and the artist. Philip Sidney in 1580 defended poets and all unconventional thinkers from Puritan charges that they are liars. He said, "A maker must imagine things that are not." And William Blake, who has been referred to earlier this evening, 200 years or more later, added, "What is now proved was once only imagined." The poet dreams of new reality, while the scientist realizes old dreams. Now, in concluding this series, I would like to leave you a thought of my own. Whether or not we think about things in advance, the future goes right on arriving day by day. Those who wish to look ahead in imagination and to find the best way to proceed are often scorned as impractical utopians, because we, the public, soon must choose which poetic dreams should and should not be scientifically realized. We had better learn that the rainbows of one good utopian are worth more than the mud puddles of 1,000 cynics. In resolutely turning the pages of the human agenda, let us all honor the human imagination, whether it be scientific or artistic. In the words of the lyrist poet Yip Harburg, look, look, look to the rainbow, follow it over the hill and stream. Look, look, look to the rainbow, follow the fellow who follows a dream. Good night.